dear Story Manifestor, I'm so glad you're here. On this channel we talk about writing pep talks, writing mindset and all things storytelling. Every Tuesday I'm Leah Falls, writer, actor and empowerment coach, and today we're talking about 10 ableist terms to get rid of in your manuscript. Well, part 1 of it. Let's go. Let's start by defining what ableism is. Ableism is the conscious or subconscious discrimination and prejudice against physically and mentally disabled people. In language, this shows up as ridicule, trivialization, demonization, infantilization, and appropriation against disabled people. Brief side note, I will be obviously using ableist language in this video, and also I will be talking about some potentially triggering things. I'm going to leave those trigger warnings in the description, so do please check them out if you're worried about something. I'm trying to be very respectful about everything and I'm not going to go into anything graphic, but if the mentioning of something does trigger you, then please check out the description. So why should we censor ourselves? Before we go into those terms, let's talk about why it's important to omit them. One vital reason is alienation. Great writing pulls the reader into the story and lets them experience it through the narrator's lens. When you use hurtful language, you're sending the message to a lot of potential readers that they are not welcome here, that they're not allowed to experience the story through the narrator's lens like the people that it's actually aimed at. And worse, you might be making yourself complicit in the ridicule or dehumanization of physically or mentally disabled people. Because if you're not alienating the reader, you are endorsing the use of this kind of language, so you might be encouraging people that it's okay to use them, and therefore that might be causing further harm. Most of the time, none of this is intentional. We all approach writing from our own cultural lens. We come to the page with our perspectives, and we might have never questioned these terms before, so please don't blame yourself for it. I've definitely used more than one of these terms before, and I went through my manuscript and deleted them, and a couple of them are still in there as commentary on why they're bad, but it's important that you don't use them without pointing out the problems. But please don't feel bad if you've used these terms or if you didn't know that there was a problem with them. There's no reason to beat yourself up here. It's all just a learning experience, so this is a good place for that. Just grab a thesaurus, this is not a thesaurus, and let's find some words that actually fit better to what we're trying to say instead of being harmful. Because honestly, when we remove guilt and blame and shame from a situation, we're much more open to learning from our mistakes and from other perspectives. Because then potential growth doesn't become an attack on our person. It just becomes more information. I encourage you to see this not as censorship, but as an evolution of language to more inclusiveness and kindness, because that's what it is in the end. Of course, you can use terms that are hurtful, but we have a lot of terms in history that we have collectively dropped because we realized that they have quite a dark meaning underneath it, and or not even underneath it, just are very offensive. And it doesn't mean that we're censoring ourselves, it means that we are learning as a society. So I very much appreciate if you would look at these terms from that kind of lens and that kind of perspective. And honestly, slurs and offensive language do not promote free speech, because free speech is about connection and it hinders connection. Let's replace these terms with respectful ones. And let's jump in. Number 1, lame. People use this colloquially to describe something that's boring or unoriginal. For example, this show is so lame. And it's a very common used word. I definitely still slip into it sometimes. It's also used to express disapproval or disappointment, like, you're not coming to my party, that's lame. But what does it actually mean? It describes a person that is physically disabled, particularly in a limb, and therefore has limp. Oh no, English pronunciation, limp, like a leg or an arm. Moving on. So they have some kind of physical movement impairment. Now, it's not a preferred term to use for disabled people and those kind of disabilities either, but if we use it for disapproval and disappointing and boring things, then we're directly ridiculing the people that it actually refers to. The word has actually Old English and Proto-Germanic roots, and it has always been associated with disabilities, but it has also always meant weak and of lesser value. So it has always been a negative term for disabilities. What to use instead? Unoriginal, mundane, trite, boring, frustrating, immature, lacking. Those are a few of my suggestions. I'm going to give you suggestions for each one of these, but those are a great thing. Let's all use them. Number 2, psycho or maniac. This term is usually used to describe villains, and it's used for erratic or harmful, dangerous behavior. It pops up in movies, TV shows, and of course books. And the big problem here is that it demonizes and vilifies mentally ill people. It equates them with danger when they're actually more likely to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator. And that's never great. The word psychopath is a hotly debated term in psychology, and a lot of modern psychologists believe that the diagnosis of psychopathy dismisses the circumstances this individual is placed in and grew up in, the environmental factors, the societal factors that cause the behavior the individual displays, and therefore sort of dehumanizes the person because we're just reducing them to a few traits they're portraying without looking at the full history of what led them there. And some people still see psychopathy as sort of a specific wing of sociopathy and antisocial behaviors, but generally speaking, it's not a term that's preferred in psychology. And also, people are never quite sure what is sociopathy and what is antisocial personality disorder and what is psychopathy. And because there's no specific description of psychopathy that like everyone agrees upon, it becomes dangerously entangled with other mental illnesses, and therefore a lot of people that have absolutely no harmful behaviors can be labeled under that label and further dehumanized. And using the word psycho to describe cruelty also implies that the only reason why someone would do terrible, evil behavior is mental illness. And that's not only problematic, it's also sort of lazy writing because we're not fully exploring why the villain is acting the way they are. We're just saying, they're mentally ill and I'm not, so psycho. Once again, I'm not judging you if you've done that, but I'd like you to reconsider it because of that. Now, maniac is sort of worse because it comes from manic depression, which is nowadays known as bipolar disorder. Manic episodes can be really difficult and painful for the people experiencing them, and the last thing they need is to be declared dangerous and to be made pariahs for it. They need care, not to become outsiders. So please, if you're thinking about picking a mental illness to fully base your villain upon, think again. What to use instead? As an adjective for psycho or maniac, I can recommend uncaring, cruel, unpredictable, reckless, cold-hearted, ruthless. As a noun, monster, fanatic, screwball, creep, brute. Did I say nightmare? Nightmare. Nightmare. I kind of like the idea of calling a person a nightmare if you want to make a really creepy villain. Yeah. Number 3, dumb. This one's gonna be controversial, but I'm not worried about controversies as much as I'm worried about losing my notebook and it falling on my toe. Now, this one really takes some practice to stop using because it's so in our everyday life, and it popped up in my manuscript a lot, and it wasn't always easy to replace because we put it in connection to a lot of other words like dumb waiter, dumb ass. It turns up in a lot of places. Now, it's a very common colloquial for stupid, but it's also very offensive. In the dictionary, it turns up as the inability to speak and the lack of intelligence. And we can already see that putting these two together is not a good thing. The term itself goes back to Aristotle, who first used it to describe deaf and non-verbal people. It has been linked to the deaf and nonverbal community for centuries, and it reminds of a very oppressive and harmful history for these people. So even if we only use it for stupid, the connotation and the association still remains, so it really is kindness to just drop it. Quick side note, deaf people are completely capable of expressing themselves and communicating either through speech or through sign language, which is in no way inferior. Nonverbal refers to anyone who doesn't use verbal language to express themselves. Nonverbal people might be part of the deaf community, or they might be part of other communities. For example, autistic people are sometimes situationally nonverbal or long-term nonverbal. This does not mean they have nothing to say, they just say it differently than mainstream society expects them to. Using dumb as stupid risks enforcing the narrative that people that don't use verbal language have nothing to say and there's nothing going on in their heads. And that's really the main issue here, because historically not using verbal language has always been equated with a lack of intelligence. So us using a term that has historically meant nonverbal for lack of intelligence nowadays, I feel like it's very difficult to say, okay, yeah, but we just don't mean the history anymore, despite us previously equating it to that. It's a very problematic term, and I know that a lot of nonverbal people are not a fan of this language, and I think we should favor their opinion on the matter over our convenience. What to use instead? Stupid, foolish, misled, misguided, brainless, unthinking, rash, irresponsible, or the good old, why would you do that? Number 4, blinding and deafening. In the same vein, let's not appropriate disability experiences and terms for situational experiences and short-term experiences. A sound isn't deafening, it is disturbing or overstimulating and overwhelming. If we use these terms as metaphors, it is trivializing the actual experience, and it is trivializing the people that are attached to those experiences. And if that's not quite convincing, the question here is, how would it sound if we used racial or gender or sexuality terms as metaphors? It becomes iffy very quickly. The disability advocate and scholar Rachel Cohen-Rottenberg says it beautiful in an article that I will link below. So let's look at the quote. The core problem with using a body as a metaphor is that people actually live in those bodies. So using identities as metaphors is always somewhat disrespectful. And a related issue is that these terms are often used as insults or to describe negative things, like they are blind to our suffering, or are you deaf? So once again, negative associations are bad. Luckily, replacing these terms as metaphors actually makes for better writing, because using blind and deaf are cliched ways of saying things anyway. You can write the sun blinded him and use problematic but simple language for it. Or you can write something like, the sun dipped the street in light, making it impossible to see anything beyond its mighty golden rays. I think that's more beautiful. And it's more creative too. So what to write instead? Figure out what the actual sensation is you're describing, and then try to nail that sensation down instead of using a simple metaphor for it. Also, obscuring works. So if you want to just use one word, obscuring is a good one. Number 5, mongoloid. I was debating putting this one on the list because I think it's so obviously terrible. But then my wife said that she still sees it in like fantasy books and settings used, so I'm going to. No judgment, no judgment. We are conditioned to believe these terms are okay, so if you use them and didn't know better, it's not your fault. It's still a terrible term though. This term isn't just ableist, it is also racist. In the late 20th century, and unfortunately sometimes in the 21st century as well, it has been used to describe people with Down syndrome or people with deformities. Apparently it's also used in body horror, which is just not good. First off, those 3 descriptors should never be in the same categories. Please don't describe disabled people as deformed, and do not use disabilities as body horror. Yes, thank you. Secondly, the connection to Down syndrome is really problematic for this term. The term was coined in the 18th century by the German scholar, Christoph Meines, who used it to describe the racial inferiority of Mongolian people. This is the moment where I sincerely apologize for my ancestors. Breaking the cycle. It came into medical usage in 1908 to describe people with Down syndrome and was officially used in medical circles until 1961. That doesn't mean it disappeared out of social circles, because when something has been part of official language and been part of, things that institutions that people trust for so long, they are less willing to let go of the term because of the whole, well, it was okay. Doctor said it was okay, the law says it was okay, so it must be okay. Why was it used for people with Down syndrome? Because apparently people thought that Mongolians and people with Down syndrome look the same. Isn't mixing ableism and racism great? No, it's not. Let's cut that shit out. What to write instead? Again, I recommend you get specific about what you're trying to write. Want to write body horror? Great, make sure none of it comes from fear of and prejudice against disabilities. We are conditioned to be afraid of things we don't know or not familiar with, so there is a certain fear of more extreme disabilities, which should never be exploited by the media because it's just adding to the fear instead of humanizing the people. So let's not use any disabilities in body horror. All horror stems from real fears, so let's not use fearful discrimination that's within us to describe monsters or to create monsters. In my book, my fantasy demons were very body horror inspired, and they had an attachment of, oh no, there's the word again, limbs. Body parts. They had an assortment of body parts attached to muscle cores and just generally things that don't match put together and from different species, and like a human leg here, an elfish arm there around a glowing fiery muscle core. That's not a disability, that is just a horrifying Frankenstein-y mix of things. So it's gross but not offensive. Gross but not offensive. Horror goals. To conclude, I want to say once more, please don't shame yourself if you've written these things or are using the terms currently, because you can change that now. At some point in your life, you thought throwing spaghetti back into your parents' face was a cool thing to do, and I assume that you don't find that as cool anymore. How weird would it be if you still do it because you refuse to see a problem with it, because acknowledging the problem with it would make you a terrible person, so you now have to throw spaghetti into everyone's face to prove that you're a good person? Nah. Let's just change ourselves. We're gonna go over the other 5 of these terms next week because the script got very long. So to make sure you don't miss us, please, don't make sure to miss us. Hit the subscribe button and the bell, and I'll see you all next week. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. You can find us on... All my social media accounts are currently hacked and blocked. But you can still find us at storymanifestors.com, which is our website, and sign up to the newsletter. And one of my Instagrams has survived, which is at Forgotten Splinters. That is the fantasy community account for my book series, but it also has memes and other fun things, so go check that out. Those are currently the only ways to follow me other than on this thing. Where am I? YouTube. Other than YouTube. I hope by the time you watch this, it's gonna be fixed, but I can't promise that. So there's gonna be other social media links in my description. If they work, I'm very happy and grateful. Let's continue this conversation in the comments. Which terms surprised you? Do you have any history or interesting facts to add to any of them? Do you have any questions, discussions? Let's talk about them. That's it. Have a wonderful week. I'll see you all next week. Oh no! My wall fell!